So teach me about soil. What are the benefits? What do people not know? Because you look at soil.
Yeah.
Before I learned anything,
Yeah.
and I don't know anything, but before I started diving into it, I was like, it's just dirt.
Right.
You know what I mean? That's the basis I think of the most Americans think about. So what does it all do?
Yeah. Okay. I wrote a list of the
Okay.
ecosystem
I love
services.
the list. Yes. I love the list.
Because I don't want to leave any off because it's really important. I'm going to start with the ones that are most relevant to cities because I suspect that's where a lot of us have been interacting with soils. And so it's kind of like out of sight, out of mind. If you're not like on a farm or growing food, you might not be thinking about it. So these are things that as you're walking around in your urban environments or suburban environments, you can think about the services that healthy soil systems provide. Okay. So when we disturb these systems, they might not provide these services. But again, with the water absorption and filtration, can't emphasize that enough, especially in places where we're experiencing so much drought. That is a huge one, which water absorption and filtration contributes to drought tolerance and flood mitigation.
I was going to ask you, I don't want to throw you off too much.
Yeah.
But with all this growth, especially in Dripping Springs, I've noticed like during heavy rains, the city, it's flooding everywhere now. Mm-hmm. Is that a reason? Because we're paving everything now. Everything has buildings, parking lots, and places that used to not flood are just flooding now.
Yes.
And this is what you're talking about.
And we have flash flooding here too in Austin. And it's a combination of the amount of impervious surfaces like you're talking about, and the soil that we do have doesn't have the structure to absorb water so quickly. Here in Texas, we get these huge storms. It's like when it rains, it pours, it just dumps a bunch of water at one time. And so we really need better structured soils to absorb that rate of rain.
Okay.
Yeah. Otherwise it runs off and that's when you get all of the flooding.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah. And then that makes our water supply really dirty. And so, if it was soaking into the soil, it would be cleaning the water and then slowly distributing it to aquifers and rivers and those kinds of things.
You're making me smarter, Andie.
Good. I'm so glad. You're already like a leg up on most people. So this is awesome. So fire mitigation, I mentioned that earlier. All of those last three ones, drought, flood, and fire, are related to the water component. So soil, good, healthy, structured soil, absorbing water, retaining water, will slow the effects of drought, flood, or fire.
Again, on the fires.
Yeah.
And we'll go through all your list, but I kind of inferred from one of your articles that like natural fires are good sometimes. Can you expand on that? Because I wasn't fully understanding that.
Yeah. So fire, again, thinking from like as an ecologist, fire is considered a disturbance. Tilling is considered a disturbance, right? So you're kind of like, well, fire sounds bad. Fire can be bad, and it's really bad on already disturbed land, which is a lot of our land where we're experiencing fires. So when I say already disturbed, it's like if a fire actually we did have a fire pretty close by here. When you leave, it's in the median. There's like a fire. And so, in a landscape like this that doesn't have a lot of soil structure or water absorption, and a fire starts, it can start going really quickly. Whereas a fire could start in a really mature landscape that has good water retention and good organic matter, and that's going to be a slower burn. And so in some ways it can be beneficial because it's going to keep that landscape in the current ecological succession that it is. So going back to the prairie, a prairie naturally, if it was undisturbed, would just become kind of a thicket and then eventually a forest and eventually like a conifer forest. That's like in theory the culmination of ecological succession is becoming a conifer forest.
What is? Can you say that word again?
Conifer.
Conifer? Okay.
Yeah, conifer. So that's like around here we have deciduous trees that drop their leaves. Conifer forests are really large trees that are like evergreen, and so they have a lot of biomass themselves, but they're also feeding a lot of carbon and sugars below ground, and so they have a really vibrant soil ecosystem too. So think of that beautiful image as like the pinnacle of ecological succession. But a prairie, which is mostly grasses and forbs, which are small plants, they're in a lower succession. And so when a fire comes through, it's actually kind of disrupting the ecosystem enough where it's going to burn down a lot of that thickety stuff that was naturally starting to seed. And it'll maintain a prairie environment, which in back pre-colonial times was really beneficial because it was such a useful landscape for bison hunting and like other kind of hunting related means of living.
Okay. No, I did not know that. So thank you for explaining that.
Yeah. Okay, wait. So that was on fire mitigation.
That was fire.
Okay. So heat reduction in city centers is a huge one. So if you have healthy soil providing, which means it's supporting vegetation, you're going to have that cooling effect in an urban environment. Which I'm sure you're familiar with how like urban sites get really hot.
Yeah, like the city of Houston is friggin', it's crazy out there.
Yeah, exactly. And then you have carbon sequestration, which we can dig into a little bit more. That's more of like a global good. Yeah. Anything we can do to have carbon going in the opposite direction than it currently is. Recreation and landscape. So any kind of like fields that you're gonna play soccer on, baseball. Landscapes that you enjoy, like parks or a garden, like a local garden, those are all supported by soil systems. And air quality is one that we don't think about very often. So I mentioned that for two main reasons. One, if you have healthy soil supporting vegetation, that's providing clean oxygen to our local environments, which is important. And then number two, if you have healthy soil systems, they're not subject to erosion, especially wind erosion, which kicks up a lot of particulate matter. And so around here, we see a lot of like hazy days. We're kind of up on a hill and you can just see like this haze. And a lot of that's just particulate matter of like the fields around this region, the soil being wafted into the air and settling over the cities and stuff.
So that means like we're losing soil then?
Oh, yes, at a pretty good rate.
So how do you can't make more soil. So, so what happens?
Yeah. So you can technically make more soil because of regeneration practices. So that's important to know. But yeah, I mean, for the longest time, we thought you would need to wait on a geological timescales for soils to be generated through weathering rock and things. That's not necessarily the case now that we know how to use biology to create new soil. But the biggest thing you can do to minimize this air pollution is not tilling your fields.
Oh gosh, but that's like the most common thing. Like every year, I was telling my little brother on the way here, like tilling the field. Like my dad does that.
Yes,
and it's like every one of my family members do that. And that's the way they learn to farm and crop and all that good stuff.
And I want to take a moment to talk about like why people till, because it makes total sense. When you till, you're breaking up any kind of compaction layer. You're creating like furrows where you're going to put the seed, and you're killing any kind of weeds. So you give your crop a leg up on on a chance to grow before the weeds come back. What else are you doing? You're basically trying to prepare the land to. Oh, the biggest one that like people don't think about is that there are studies that show tilling provides a nutrient boost to new seedlings. And my understanding is that is true. And the reason though is because when you till, you're breaking up all that fungi and all of those organisms I was talking about and killing them, and then they're being digested by the bacteria. And so what you're really doing is creating like a bacterial bloom. Like we're more familiar visually with a bacterial bloom in like the Gulf, right? Yeah. The same thing's kind of happening on our land, but we can't see it. When we till, we're creating this bloom of bacteria. And so we're actually releasing carbon because bacteria respire. So they do release CO2. And so that means we're losing some fertility when we do that. But they're also unpacking nutrients that were in those organisms, which does give a little nutrient boost to these seedlings. And so you gotta understand, like, tilling made sense, and it still makes sense to a lot of people. But the more you know about how that disturbance kind of keeps you in this state where you're chained to all these inputs that are costly and they're getting more expensive. So that's the big thing right now that's like starting to have people shift and look for alternative options, regenerative methods being one of them. Is I can't afford this nitrogen anymore. I can't afford. One guy told me he's spending like $300 an acre to grow corn in Kansas, and if he could go biological, it'd be $15 an acre.
Holy crap.
So, like, it's kind of going to be a no-brainer at some point. But yeah, people are scared, and I get that.
There's a pesticide or herbicide that my family is all getting into, that you just spray it. You spray the land one time, and it keeps the weeds down for like 6-7 years or something like that. So knowing that people are doing stuff like that, walk me through the process. Like, have you ever worked with a rancher or a farmer that did this traditional way of farming, and then you taught them and they saw the benefits from the other way? Have you worked with one personally?
Yeah, so I've only been doing this soil service for like a year and a half now. So it's like kind of I haven't had anyone go from like start to finish through that narrative. Okay. I'm very excited to have.
I want to take you to my family out there in West Texas.
Heck yeah, in West Texas. Yeah. What do they grow?
So it's basically for hunting land. They grow like what do they grow out there? Like oats and stuff like that. But it's basically for hunting. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, you're asking me about the process, right? Like, what do you do, or what have I done? Maybe let me provide some context so people know like what I actually do day to day. I have a microscope behind me here, and I mostly receive soil samples or samples of people's amendments, which are usually compost or like a compost tea. And I give them insight into what's living in there or not living in there, and then provide some guidance on what you can do to improve the microbiome of the soil. Okay. And so what I hope to do is be able to provide an amendment to somebody as like a stopgap until they can provide their own amendment for themselves. Because the thing is, like, most of these farms and ranches, they have the resources to make their own great amendments, like their inoculation amendments to raise these microbes. But it takes a little time, right? So maybe 3 or 4 months would be like a quick compost option, but there's some methods that can take a year or so. So I would love to have an option. I'm working on my side yard on like making amendments right now and looking at them under the microscope to get to a place where if somebody has a specific landscape and they want to start transitioning their field, depending on what they're growing, they're going to need a different kind of amendment. So if you're growing trees, that's going to be a different amendment than if you're growing tomatoes. Okay.
And how do you make these amendments?
It's composting, but it's like really strategic composting. So when you think compost, you might think of like a backyard compost where you're throwing food scraps and
like
stuff.
Bananas and apples and stuff like that.
Yeah. Which is great, but that's not what I'm doing.
Okay.
So what I'm doing is really procuring specific amounts of material. Like I really know the quantity that I'm doing. And I also know I have some amount of insight into what's called the carbon to nitrogen ratio. And so that informs how the pile heats up, which is important because it's going to kill any pathogens that happen to be in the pile. It kills weed seeds. And then the great like relief of the pile is when it's cooling down, and that's when like the beneficial stuff is given a chance to grow. And that's the general process. And so there's many methods out there, but that's the one that I'm trying right now. That's called thermophilic composting. Okay. Yeah, which is
so awesome, Andie. Yeah. That's amazing. Yeah, so are you self-employed? Do you work with okay.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yeah. I work for Rhizos LLC. I wear my shirt today.
Represent.
Yeah. So that's awesome. That's my business. And right now all I do is offer microscopy services. and some amount of consulting, but I'm in a program to become a certified consultant, so I really have to prove that I can turn a dirt into a living soil, like an actual disturbed ecosystem into a healed regenerative landscape. And so and the program I'm doing that with is Dr. Elaine Ingham. I consider her like the mother of soil biology.
I'm about to say, that name sounds really familiar.
Yeah, she's been in the game. Has like 4 decades worth of research under her belt and is now sharing her knowledge to a more global audience. So instead of just remaining in the university system and within the limitations of academia, she's taken her content and her knowledge online and is now teaching people like me who are really interested in this but don't necessarily want to go get a PhD and do research. I want to actually practically help people.
Right.
And so she and a whole slew of mentors are doing this work. So and anyone can do it. Like a lot of the people in the program have transitioned their careers. So that maybe they had a career in tech for 10 to 15 years and they were looking to switch it up. They learned about soil, got interested, and now this is like a really good pathway to get up to speed on what you need to know to really practically help any kind of land steward.
You're motivating me.
Yeah, you're gonna transition up podcasting.
Yeah, switch it up, man. Get out of the chemical industry. Yeah. All right. So, what else is on the list?
Okay, so those are the top ones that come to mind when I think of cities. But some other important ones worth mentioning. Obviously, food. Healthy soil contributes to food production, fiber production. So we don't think about that very often, but all of our cotton clothes or wool, a lot of our fibers are coming from soil systems. Our building materials too. So whether that's bricks, mortar, or wood, like lumber, that's coming from a soil system. Medicine is one that we don't think of often, but a lot of our antibiotics and things that have helped us throughout history have been isolated from microbes that were discovered in soil systems. Wow. And additionally, think herbalism and plants. Like we've also got a fair amount of medicine coming from plants, which come from soil. And decomposition is a huge one. So can you imagine a world where nothing decomposed?
Yeah.
Just
that's crazy. That's
crazy,
right? That's what scares me. That's what there's a lot of people on YouTube that are saying we're heading that way.
Right. Well, and that's the thing. Somebody was asking me the other day, why do some farmers burn their fields? And I was like, it's kind of like they do it for all the reasons you would do tilling, like get rid of the weeds, and in some ways it's generating some nutrients in the same fashion as tilling. One benefit of burning instead of tilling is that you're not creating compaction. So the tiller is disrupting compaction that's at the top, but it's creating compaction below. And plant roots know no bounds, so they could be growing deeper, but a lot of times you end up with this hard pan where the tiller had been scraping by. But burning is primarily used to burn off all of the plant residue that wasn't breaking down in the field. And the reason it's not breaking down is because there's no soil biology there. It's just it's just a bunch of dirt, and
it's just like a dead landscape, basically.
It's a dead landscape, and that's why I call it a substrate. And that's a sciencey term, but a substrate is just something that something living grows on. It's just a substrate that's supposed to be sterile. And when we do that, we're putting the onus on us to figure out what to feed a plant, and that's a huge responsibility.